Welcome to the Bioinformatics CRO podcast. I'm your host, Grant Belgard, and joining me today is Jon Chee, CEO and founder of Exceeder. Exceeder provides services to the biotech industry and more. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jon and hear about your company, what you do. And I'd really like to hear about, what you've learned about the industry and what you've learned building out your own company.
Thanks for having me, Grant. Really looking forward to this. So Exceeder, we're an equipment leasing company that solely focuses on the laboratory space. And what we're really trying to do here is enable researchers to secure the equipment they need at an affordable price so they can get their research done and reach their milestones faster. And we also provide ongoing repair and maintenance coverage for the duration of the lease term. Exceeder really was founded just kind of like scratch my own itch. In a former life, I was doing wet lab research 10 years ago. And really when I was in the lab, and this was at UC Berkeley, I was doing research and a lot of the pain points I felt revolved around equipment usage and equipment maintenance. More often than not, I felt like I was running up the hill to the flow core to run samples every day. And I figured there's got to be a more efficient way to do this and an efficient use of time and, capital. So from there, really spoke to our PIs, tried to get a feel of, is it just a me problem or is this more broadly a kind of pain point that everyone on campus was feeling? What we ended up finding was that this was a very common problem. Equipment would break down, equipment is very expensive to procure, maintain. Since then, we really started off with a pilot run of what we do. So we do equipment leasing and repair and maintenance coverage for the said equipment for the broader life sciences, really trying to alleviate these kind of like financial and operational pain points for those in the lab, and especially, for the earlier stage ventures. And we started off in the academic and government laboratory space, which we can get into more. That was a baptism of fire, especially as an early entrepreneur. But we participate a lot in kind of supporting early stage ventures, biotech, pharma, diagnostics, and really helping them get the equipment they need to do their research and also making sure that they're supported along the way. But that's kind of what we sought out to do and really have been doing it ever since then. That's our thing.
So I find it really interesting that you started with universities and government, right? Because in many ways, they're more difficult institutions to sell to. Can you maybe talk a bit about that decision and kind of what challenges you faced as a new company?
Hindsight is 2020. I want to say this was a calculated go-to-market, but it was more along the lines of that was my immediate network and community, having, just participated doing research, in my early career in academia. And so due to just the general proximity, kind of getting in touch with laboratories it was much more difficult. So we were like, okay, well, this is our community. Maybe we can kind of give this a shot and see if we can get some buy-in from our neighbors. And I don't know if I would recommend going to, trying to go through the government procurement system as the initial go-to-market, but hopefully someone can learn from my mistakes and slam dunk it should they choose to do this. But as an early entrepreneur, really, I think going through the UC systems procurement, we worked with like Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, Lawrence Livermore, and really what the procurement taught us is we had to be very airtight in making sure the contractual language was, amenable to the broader system. They were gracious enough, realizing that we were young entrepreneurs fresh out of the lab. They would work with us and give us feedback on where they wanted to see things go. What that really ended up doing is it helped us hone our product from both a, pricing standpoint. How do we structure these contracts so they're mutually beneficial for everyone? And just really showing us how we can, or what we needed to do is get buy-in from numerous stakeholders. It's not just the end user in the lab. There's the finance department, there's the procurement department, there's legal. And so that really opened our eyes. It's not that there's one person that you need to appeal to. There's many, many parties. And I think it was really it was like the baptism of fire, really.
But you made it.
Yeah. I'm very grateful that we made it. In the very beginning, it's there's a lot of existential anxiety when it comes to when you're young and trying to put up a bid and go through the procurement system. But I think those are probably the big lessons is, really how to appeal and really support all stakeholders. And really it helped us fine tune our product. And obviously since then we've branched out outside of the academic research, government research realm. And that when we did decide to go into for-profit, there was a lot more polish to our product. Whereas if we did it inverse and we went directly into the for-profit sector first, most early stage ventures don't have procurement departments, let alone a full-time finance department, legal department. And I think we would have probably been a lot sloppier in putting out the minimum viable product. Whereas through this baptism of fire, really honed our product and our offering.
That's interesting. What were the biggest things that changed between your first sale and how things operate now?
There's a fair amount of things that have changed. The pricing strategy definitely changed. We realized one price does not fit every end user. Obviously, if you are a government institution or you're UC Berkeley, you should be getting very, very different pricing than an early stage venture. And then they should also get different pricing than a large multinational. And that's purely because of the dynamic of the entity. And that's something that we learned the hard way because we took our first stab. We're like, let's see if this pricing works. And quite frankly, we were green at that time. And, when we went through procurement, they're like, hey, this is a little bit off mark, but here, try again. And they were generous enough to give us that feedback. And so that really helped us fine tune how we priced things appropriately for the end user based on the kind of quote unquote risk, because obviously we provide leases. There's a credit risk component that we need to evaluate. So that really was honed through procurement. And then also it allowed us to put out more accurate proposals forth when we went to the for-profit. So it didn't completely seem unreasonable. We were somewhere within the ballpark. And obviously since then, we've gotten so many repetitions off it. We've worked with so many labs since then that it's a well-oiled machine. Now we know based on what the company's all about, what the equipment is, what is the game plan, what is the science behind it. We can very much create a bespoke solution that is appropriate for the end user. So that's a really big one that, we're always trying to improve, but something that we really fine-tuned during our early days. And then the second component is the kind of repair and maintenance support throughout the lease that we provide. Our kind of flavor of equipment leasing is that we don't want to just be a financing solution to the lab where it just simply get the equipment in there and just make payments. We pride ourselves in supporting the end user throughout the term of the lease, making sure if there's any equipment damages, we make sure that it is repaired and brought back up to spec as quickly as possible. Because I know when there's an equipment damage and you're in the middle of a mission critical assay, and a milestone is coming up, it can become a pretty tenuous situation. So we do provide support for that. This one was especially with Lawrence Berkeley. We had to figure out what was the level of support that is required to keep a high-performing laboratory operational. So that was another learning experience. And obviously, all these learned lessons we carried over to the for-profit sector. But yeah, I would say those two is finding a way to create bespoke financial solutions for the end user that fits their needs and making sure that we provide the right level of operational support for the end user as well, so they can just not worry about the potential damages that might come up throughout the lease term.
One risk of working with startups in a line of business like yours is startups not infrequently fail. How does that typically play out? Is it usually pretty clean? Have you ever had to, call the repo man? How does that work?
I would say we kind of do things differently over here. And, something that is different about us is that we're not a bank. If you're a bank, you're using depositors' accounts for loans and lending products. With that comes all kinds of regulatory requirements. Much like if you have a mortgage on a house, the bank is going to use your house as collateral. They're the ones who have kind of a regulatory burden, and they will definitely call the repo man in the case of non-compliance of the loan. Now, and then, other leasing companies have different models, and I won't speak for them, but more often than not, the way that leasing companies kind of, where do they get their capital to create these leases is they do the fund model where they would go raise investments from limited partners, whether it be family offices, institutions like endowments, pensions, you name it, hedge funds, fund of funds. So they're using other people's capital as well. And when they use other people's capital, there's also going to be a requirement that you structure your credit facility. It might really require the repo man to go in and repossess. For us, what makes us a little bit different is that we don't use outside capital. We don't use depositors' accounts. We don't use LPs' capital. All of the capital comes off our balance sheet. Basically, we're underwriting and funding leases to the end user. And in the case of early stage ventures, we realize this. we totally realize that it is a non-zero chance that things might not work out. And so and obviously we need to make sure that we come to an amicable solution, but we pride ourselves in being long-term partners for these companies when things are good and when things are bad. We always pride ourselves in being able to find an amicable solution to make sure that you're taken care of and we're taken care of. When we sense that there's a cash crunch coming up, that we immediately send someone in and they repo the equipment. It's more of like, hey, let's have a conversation. Where are things at? Are you trying to get to your next funding round? Do you need help getting to that next funding round? How can we be helpful? And we want to give the breathing room to these early stage ventures so they can get there. And that's our goal from the very beginning. Is the way we approach equipment leasing, the life sciences, is that there's kind of three components that are very, very important and critical to the success of these early stage ventures. It's making sure you have adequate cash runway, make sure that you can keep the lights on. Second, you need the equipment to run your assays, and you need your expert staff to be able to run these assays. And if you have all three, you're in a good position to hopefully to hit your milestones. And we want to help get you there. We realize that one of the components is making sure you have cash runway, and we're not going to impose our will and prevent you from getting there. We're going to try and help you get there. And that's kind of our mentality around it. We take a very stakeholder approach, making sure the lab, the company is taken care of, the investors are taken care of, the equipment manufacturers and us. We realize there's a lot of parties involved. We take a holistic approach there, whereas it could be if you're using depositors' accounts, it's a very different scenario because the federal government is going to impose its will and make sure that you take care of the depositor accounts in a very different way. But we approach it from that angle.
It's interesting. I mean, that's one thing I like to do at times too, right? Basically, we have a network of investors who are looking for deal flow. We work with early stage companies that periodically in this industry are going to need investment. So, it's obviously not something that's formalized or anything like that, but it's interesting to hear you say that. I mean, I guess that's kind of maybe a bit of a common practice among those who kind of specialize in working with smaller companies, right? Because it makes sense for everyone. If the company is doing a good job, it's kind of in everyone's best interest to make sure they're funded adequately.
Yeah. And I think the way we look at it too is that great companies, even like the best companies out there, will have ups and downs. Outside of biotech, Facebook had its ups and downs. Apple was on the brink of bankruptcy, right? And obviously, Facebook and Apple are what they are now.
They're doing all right.
Yeah, they're doing all right. We realize that just because there's a little bit of volatility, we're not spooked by that. And we want to help support you through that volatility and get you to that next place that you need to be. Whether it be the next funding round, help you get to your next milestone, help you make that next hire. If you raise a seed round that's like 2 to 6 million and you have to spend like 1.5 million on equipment, that's 1.5 million that can no longer be allocated towards staffing. So remember, there's the three things we focus on is having adequate cash, having the equipment that you need, and staffing your company with the experts that will take you where you need to go. So we're trying to get you there. We want you to have all three. And so that's what we're really seeking to do is like make your dollars go farther and give you kind of that flexibility to hire. And it's a competitive hiring market too. So for these entrepreneurial scientists, it can be a lot to manage. We don't want to be a bottleneck on you, and we don't want to be additional anxiety or stress. We want to be supportive throughout.
So tell us about those early years, right? I mean, obviously, Exeter is grown to a pretty respectable size with a pretty good portfolio now. And of course, going from 0 to 1 is always a challenge. And especially, you were starting in such a, in some ways, difficult market. How did you do it?
You're exactly right. It was a very different time, especially for early stage life science. I think at that time, what we encountered was the kind of startup ecosystem was just beginning. Back then, a lot of the large multinationals had a very robust in-house R&D function. And that's kind of when we were starting. It was very difficult. Back then, this kind of SaaS wave hadn't really picked up quite yet. So when it came to getting the company off the ground, we didn't have all these tools to do normal business functions. Like Gusto didn't exist yet. Email marketing was very nascent. All of these things that make the barriers to entry much lower did not exist at that time. So it was a lot of like elbow grease. Well, admittedly, at that time, I wasn't quite sure if the timing was wrong or did I get into an industry that was this the wrong industry to be in?
I think that's something all entrepreneurs ask themselves in the early days.
Yeah, it very much. There was a lot of existential dread very early because, like I said, the SaaS tools that enables entrepreneurs now weren't available. So a lot of it was old fashioned, just like me either making calls or going in person and trying to meet potential clients. And you can imagine it is difficult, especially for folks in the lab. There's like, I don't want to talk. I have my own work to do. In the very beginning, there's a lot of that sweat equity that needs to go in. But then something that we think about a lot is just like those early clients that were willing to give us a shot really helped us get into that rhythm. It took a little bit of time to figure out the first couple clients that would help propel us to the next level.
Where did your starting capital come from?
So the starting capital was actually from friends and family. We don't have outside kind of like institutional equity in our company. So our company is 100% employee owned. There's like a small sliver of friends and family that when no one was willing to make that investment, we still don't have outside equity, but the friends and family were willing to make that bet. And then the rest are owned by the employees. And so, you can imagine it kind of like compounded the stress because it's your friends and family's money and they're betting on you. So that was very anxiety inducing. I will say, me personally, I'm not like the serial entrepreneur type. I look back then at those early days and I was just
a nervous wreck.
Yeah, sleepless nights, nervous wreck. I mean, is this the right market? Wrong timing? What is this? But I think it always ended up going back to my experience in the lab at Berkeley, just seeing the research being done. I feel like whether it was conscious or subconscious, I was like, this is going somewhere. Seeing the research being done led me to be optimistic about the industry. And so a lot of the time, it was a matter of sticking to it, making sure that we raise awareness. And when the biotech market does have its moment, we are prepared. And so, like I mentioned before, when we first started, the industry was very different. Multinationals had their own in-house R&D. The IPO market was not nearly as hot. Obviously, M&A was not as hot because all the multinationals had their own R&D going on. And then there was this kind of like paradigm shift where the larger enterprises, they reduced the in-house R&D, realizing that from a capital allocation perspective, it might be a better investment to let the startups focus on more high-risk projects.
Let someone else take the risk, then buy it when it's a bit more proven out.
Yeah, exactly. And that had ripple effects everywhere because once that started happening, the venture community was able to say, hey, like our investments are de-risked because at the end of the day, VCs need to have a liquidity event, an exit, whether it be an IPO, merger acquisition, whatever. And when this happened, it's like, okay, the big strategics are now looking to acquire these smaller entities who are doing more kind of risky research. Once that happened, the capital inflows to the startup community really started coming in, and we saw, more and more entrepreneurial scientists take that leap. Because, back then it was super risky. It was like, are you going to leave your job at Pfizer to start a startup that may or may not have an opportunity to IPO or get acquired? And then, you look at clinical trials, you're like, oh my goodness, it is so expensive. We had a lot of existential dread. Is the timing wrong? Is the industry wrong? But once that shift happened, we were kind of
You're well poised.
Yeah, well poised to be supportive in that growth. There's a large component of luck. It could have gone very differently. That paradigm shift could have just not happened. But, very grateful that it did. And I think it was kind of the testing grounds, like during those early days, going through government research, academic research, we kind of were just like practicing, honing the craft, getting better. And then when that paradigm shift happened, we're like, okay, we're ready for the prime time. Let's do this now. I wish I had better advice on how to get from 0 to 1. But I think if you have deep conviction on your thesis, at least in my case, it would behoove you to stick around long enough for the adoption to happen. If the thesis is like you believe to be rock solid, I would recommend sticking it out and trying to be well poised for when things really do pick up. Right now, obviously the past year has been the past year. And that's another paradigm shift that's kind of like happening. Who could see it coming? But, it kind of accelerated all kinds of like trends and pulled forward things that would have taken 5-10 years to actually come to fruition. It's things like that. It's just like making sure you're building for resilience and be well poised for when the opportunity presents itself to action on it.
And did those inflection points correspond to major changes to the composition of your team?
It did. The overall product, it's been fine-tuned, but there hasn't been, seismic shifts in what we do. But when there were the paradigm shifts, it kind of was like drinking out of a fire hose. When you're at that stage, there's kind of, as they call it, like technical debt. You kind of hack things together. And it works for, maybe when you're like a team of 2, 3, you can like Frankenstein together these like Google Sheets, Excel sheets, and it works for a little bit, but eventually, like all debt, you eventually need to pay it down. When the paradigm shift happened, we were scaling up the sales team to kind of, make sure that we can give each of the laboratories the attention they deserve. We really need to, one, improve the processes, the tech stack, making sure that we don't break underneath the paradigm shift. We try to be as proactive as we can about it. We want to be more proactive, less reactionary. As an entrepreneur, it is our job to kind of see around the curve and kind of prepare for it. You're not going to be able to catch everything, but we try our best to do that. The first paradigm shift is like really just like scaling the sales function. But the next shift was just making sure that no one falls through the cracks. There's a lot of parties that we're managing, making sure we're taking care of our vendors, the manufacturers, making sure all internal parties are taken care of and not losing track of those conversations. So we had, again, revamped the customer success function and the operations function. Not that it wasn't working before. It's just that when you go through these growth spurts, your existing systems were not built for that.
Well, I guess one of the advantages of bootstrapping is you, in some ways, have time to tool up, to be at the right stage for the size your company's at, and to ensure, other kind of managers of the company and so on can grow into their roles, as opposed to, the size and the structure of the division that you're directing or something. It becomes qualitatively different every year, right? Can you maybe comment a bit on how has that been for you, right? Obviously, Exceeder's come a long way over the last decade. And I'm sure you've come a long way over the last decade. Other than kind of school of hard knocks, how have you tooled up?
In the early days, there was, again, kind of like I mentioned, a lot of sweat equity that went into it. But you can't do that forever. You can't like work every single day and not have time for friends, family, loved ones, hobbies. You can't do that forever. And it's kind of what you alluded to as kind of like bootstrapping this company. We have the luxury of, we can take our time a little bit more. High growth companies, different kind of schema that you need to live by. You're looking to triple, double. You don't really have that luxury to have that balance. I'll only speak for Exceeder here, but what I've learned is that building in balance into your work life, and I try to have our team also have this balance, enables them to really come into work refreshed and to be able to do their best work and not feel completely burnt out. And especially during remote work, that becomes even more difficult when there's like not clear separation between work and personal space.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw this recent study. I thought it was fascinating. It was reporting people were working, more than ever before with this shift to remote work, a couple hours more a day, while at the same time becoming less productive even overall, not just productivity per hour, because so much of that extra time was soaked up by meetings and agonizing over emails and things like this.
Yeah. Yeah. I did see that. Like we do a lot of team check-ins, making sure like, how is the remote work panning out for you? Do you find that you're filling that space with more unproductive work? What we ended up coming to is we definitely try to have clear cutoffs. Like when work is over, please, I do not want to see your green bubble on. Please go gray. Go spend time away from your computer and things like that. And yes, remote work has removed the commute component, obviously. You have an hour probably more in the morning and an hour probably at the end of the day. We try not to just fill that space because we can. We try to say, hey, with those extra hours in your day, can you spend more time with your kids? Go see your friends, get exercise, go for a hike. These kind of things, they're not directly work productive, but it's a sustainable practice and helps, the team come back, like I said, refreshed and actually more productive. So we don't want to just, because you've freed up this 1 hour in the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, we don't want you to just like go into more meetings. So we try to keep the hours the same, but give you that extra hour to do more things that are personal priorities of yours. And that's what we have found has kept the burnout at bay, especially for the remote work situation.
So I see we're coming up on time soon. So I want to make sure we have an opportunity to hear some advice you might have for others. And especially, I'd be keen to hear, what's a contrarian view that you hold?
When it comes to advice coming from a STEM background, there's a large emphasis on like specializing. But before I was in the wet lab, I actually took a lot of classes on business, a lot of like legal classes too, and philosophy classes.
Did you have kind of a Steve Jobs calligraphy application?
Yeah. And not to sound cliche, but like one of the most impactful classes I actually took in school was actually a philosophy class on moral ethics. And without getting into the weeds of it, it's been a long time, and the philosophers out there might, catch me on this, but there's kind of a utilitarian philosophy where, cost benefit, that kind of calculus is kind of what defines a moral life or decision. And then there's kind of like on the other end, there's like the Kantian moral philosophy where there are binary rights and wrong based on whether or not you're treating others with dignity. And if anyone watched The Good Place, that's kind of one of the shows that kind of gives a little primer on that. What I'm getting at is that taking a kind of well-rounded, not just the STEM path course load informed how we built Exceeder. And I think it's what has made us in our DNA different. Like I said, we always try to treat every single stakeholder that we work with dignity and not just focus on shareholder value on its own at the expense of others. And that's a very utilitarian thing, is like, if we cost benefit analyze, profit maximize, that's the right decision. If I had strictly stuck to the STEM course load, I don't think Exceeder would be the way it is today. When it comes to like a leasing company, there is a way to do it. And I think coming from a different angle with a kind of like the science background, just having taken this diverse course load really helped us build what I would like to believe is a unique organization that approaches the life science community in a different way. And we offer a product that is differentiated and beneficial to all parties. So what I would say is specializing is obviously important, but don't feel like it's wasted time exploring different fields of study, because I think it can inform where you want to go as an entrepreneur. And how your company can be built differently and approach problems from different angles.
What's the worst piece of advice you've received on this journey?
One of the early pieces of advice that was given me is that if you want to secure a customer and that customer requires 100 cold calls, so how many customers do we want to secure? Do we need 10 customers? We need to do 10 times 100 cold calls. That kind of mentality of it's purely a grind and grit. Basically, the advice was giving me like hustle harder. And I think that was kind of one of the worst pieces of advice for me, because I think you can be working smarter. And so early on, that's what I was doing. I was like, I need to cold call this many people, and I need to get into laboratories, like get FaceTime with this many people in order to secure X amount of customers. Yeah, so that's probably the worst piece of advice, is like hustle harder because that's the only solution there is. But I think there are more effective ways than just the status quo.
It's great advice. I think we've discovered similar things along the way. Yeah, so thank you so much, Jon, for joining us. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Grant. I really appreciate you having me on.